From the JAMA Network, this is JAMA Otolaryngology Head and Neck Surgery Author Interviews. Conversations with authors exploring the latest clinical research, reviews, and opinions featured in JAMA Otolaryngology Head and Neck Surgery.
Hi everyone, this is Paul Bryson from the Cleveland Clinic, Department of Otolaryngology Head and Neck Surgery, and your web editor for JAMA Oto. I'm joined today by Dr. Alexander Hillel, Professor of Otolaryngology Head and Neck Surgery at Johns Hopkins. Today we're going to talk about a novel clinical trial involving the adjuvant oral use of Everolimus for idiopathic subglottic stenosis. Dr. Hillel, it's great to have you on the podcast. Welcome.
Thank you, Paul. It's wonderful to be here.
Well, I have to say, when we see trials like this in the literature, particularly for rare diseases like idiopathic subglottic stenosis, I really wanted to, highlight the work, help our listener understand the background that led to the work, and then we can talk about some of the findings and then, maybe paint the picture for what you see in the future in this landscape for this sort of disease. So congratulations to you and your team. But if you would, tell us a little bit about idiopathic subglottic stenosis and how you arrived at this trial design.
Sure. So idiopathic subglottic stenosis, as you mentioned, is a rare disease. It affects really only women, tends to be women in their 40s and 50s that it comes on. These women are otherwise healthy and they spontaneously develop scar in their subglottis right below their vocal folds. It causes them to have shortness of breath, usually with exertion. Most of them are misdiagnosed with asthma, oftentimes for a number of years. In fact, the average length of time before individuals with ISGS are diagnosed is 2 years. And right now, really our only therapy for ISGS is surgical. And that can range from anything from endoscopic excision and dilation to a laser wedge resection to an open airway cricotracheal resection. And so there's really very few, I would say no medical therapies. There's some interesting preliminary data on serial intralesional steroid injections, which seems to work in some patients. But in general, what we have is a rare disease that is treated with surgery. And therefore, there's the potential for medical treatment to advance our care for ISGS.
And I understand just from kind of looking at the bibliography and some of the body of work that you, the team, others in our community have done, that there is starting to be some basic science support for potentially different medications or drug repurposing for this sort of condition. We're not alone in the sense that there are other fibrosing and inflammatory conditions and other organ systems, but I think just in the infancy for idiopathic subglottic stenosis. Can you elaborate on just a little bit of the preclinical work that you've done and your team has done over the years, really?
Sure. We have preclinical models as well as in vitro models that allowed us to look at a number of therapeutics that might inhibit the growth or reverse fibrosis. And I'll step back a sec because you mentioned there's a multitude of fibrotic diseases out there that affects the lung, the liver. But what is really unique about idiopathic subglottic stenosis is a very homogeneous group of individuals who suffer from it, specifically women of Northern European descent, which actually makes for a very good study group in a clinical trial setting. And we arrived at Everolimus in part because it is FDA approved as an immunotherapy for kidney transplant patients. And it's also what is used in drug-eluting stents to prevent restenosis of coronary artery disease. So that made it a very promising drug and one that was easier to repurpose than some of the other non-FDA approved drugs that we were looking at. And then finally, I'll mention that when we tested it in our preclinical model in an adjuvant setting, it was very successful at preventing the recurrence of fibrosis.
Yeah, it's very exciting to be able to take that basic science. You developed a model and then take it literally from the bench to patients. And as you said earlier, there's just not a lot of this for this disease condition. So walk us through a little bit of the methods.
Yeah, as you mentioned, Paul, it really was a 9 to 10-year process as we went from testing in the Petri dish to testing in small animals to then finally getting to bring it into patients. And that was very exciting. It was really a team effort. A lot of people were involved. A big shout out to my co-authors, as well as my colleagues at Hopkins Laryngology, because we really did it together.
Can you share with the listener a little bit about the design of the study?
Thanks, Paul. This was a adjuvant medical design where we used 1.5 milligrams of Everolimus for 6 weeks following an endoscopic excision and dilation. Our primary outcome measure was the safety of Everolimus for those 6 weeks, but we also had some efficacy outcomes, some secondary outcomes, looking at peak expiratory flow and also looking at airway surface area as measured by CAT scan. And we looked at the narrowest portion of the cricoid, which is where the subglottic stenosis affects. And then following dilation, participants were followed for a 6-month period. So 6 of those weeks they were on the Everolimus, and we followed them for a total of 6 months after dilation.
That's great. I would encourage the listener to take a look at some of the peak flow papers that are in the literature. It's really a nice tool for patients, particularly if you take care of patients with this condition. It's an easy way to track, and it's something that they can report to you that's somewhat objective as opposed to just how they're feeling with exercise and things. I think it's also very clever to take a look at the CT scan and how it correlates. And you're right, that work hasn't exactly been done in that manner. So what did you find?
Yeah, and I do want to mention a couple other things. One, we developed this adjuvant trial design so we could compare to what their historical interval between surgery was. And in a sense, piggybacking off of our head and neck oncology colleagues and other oncology trials where an adjuvant therapy is added to the standard of care. And in this trial, we had individuals who entered it and 7 who completed therapy. 1 stopped therapy 1 day after entering the trial because unfortunately a family member came down with COVID at her house and she did not appropriately want to be on an immunosuppressant while exposed to COVID. The other 7 patients completed the 6-week adjuvant course of Everolimus. And what we found was that it was safe. There were minor adverse events experienced in 3 of the 7 patients. 2 of them had an infection, and 1 had aphthous ulcers, which is a known complication of the medicine. All the participants maintained their peak expiratory flow while on Everolimus and for another 7 weeks after their 6-week course of Everolimus. And that's really where we saw a dichotomy at that point. And even though it was a small study of 7 patients, it split up into a sub-cohort of 4 patients whose disease came back relatively quickly. And it came back more rapidly than their historical dilation interval. And we began to see that at about 7 to 8 weeks after completing the course of Everolimus. The other 3 participants maintained their peak expiratory flow longer, and all 3 of them had, to this point, have had a longer dilation interval or interval between surgery in that responder subcohort. And so I think we do see this with this disease. We see this with serial intralesional steroid injections or SILC, where you have responders to SILC and you have non-responders. And it was a similar finding here with Everolimus.
Yeah, it's very interesting too, right? I mean, it sounds like it was a safe therapy for folks, but I think it's one of those things where it was not only a phase 1 study, but it begs for more time and more people.
And I think that's what we're thinking about, right? And the question we had, what was interesting in a clinical trial like this, there's a lot of emotions. One, when you're putting patients on an immunosuppressive therapy that really is only given to patients who've had a kidney transplant, you're thinking, oh boy, I really hope they don't have any side effects. And so it was great to see everyone who started the medicine really complete the 6-week course. But then what you start to see when you're following them are the non-responders. They fall off more quickly. And so you move into a low period where you're thinking, oh, this isn't really working. And it then wasn't until we continued to follow our entire cohort that we could detect a signal in the responder cohort. So that led us to think, well, was our dosage of everolimus? We chose a relatively low dose of 1.5 milligrams daily for the purpose of keeping side effects low. And was the dose too low, and or was the length of time that they were on that adjuvant therapy too short? So I think those are some of the questions we're asking as we think about what is the next step for this exciting therapy. Would it be a longer course at the same dose? Would it be a longer course at a slightly higher dose? Because while the patients were on the everolimus, they really maintained their airway. And it wasn't until they came off the everolimus that we began to see that their peak expiratory flows began to tail off.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very exciting. And as you said in the introduction, we haven't had a real non-surgical innovation in this space for a long time, beyond intralesional steroid injections and maybe some of the surgical therapies, but there hasn't been a real frame shift or a paradigm shift with, other medicines, let alone studying them in a trial setting.
Yeah, I agree with you, Paul. And I think that's one of the key takeaways here, and really not just in airway disease that we treat in laryngology, but all laryngology. We really were a subspecialty of treating rare disease. And I think that a prospective study like this that looks at therapeutic interventions, in this case, it was a medical intervention, but I think designs like this can look at novel therapies or interventional procedures that we do in the office, will herald an era of evidence-based laryngology. And I think what this shows is that we can do it on a small scale. And if there are promising results, we have collaboratives in place. We've seen it in Zenker's. We're seeing it in retrograde cricopharyngeal dysfunction. And then we've seen it in idiopathic subglottic stenosis with the North American Airway Collaborative, that we can then move promising interventions, promising therapies into a larger multi-institutional collaborative setting for that phase 2 placebo-controlled trial.
And I think it's going to be sooner as opposed to later. Well, I really appreciate your time today. We're excited about this work. Congratulations to you and the team, and we'll look forward to seeing it when it comes to press.
Thank you very much, Paul.
I am Paul Bryson, and I've been speaking with Dr. Alexander Hillel about the adjuvant oral use of Everolimus for idiopathic subglottic stenosis. You can find a link to the article in this episode's description. To follow this and other JAMA Network podcasts, please visit us online at jamanetworkaudio.com or search for JAMA Network wherever you get your podcasts. This episode was produced by Daniel Musisi at the JAMA Network. Thanks for listening.